Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today, our goal is to absolutely tear down and deeply analyze the geographic, bureaucratic, and spiritual machinery that sustained history's longest-lasting empire, ancient Egypt. We're not just going to look at pretty gold masks here. No, we are going to act as investigators and really dissect the engine of this incredible superpower to understand how it survived for 3 millennia.
You know what? We're just going to skip the traditional agenda today because we absolutely need to jump straight into the sand-swept dunes of ancient Egypt. Let's just dive right in, shall we? For centuries, there are these two monumental mysteries that have totally captured our collective imagination, completely dominating how we view the ancient world. On one hand, we've got architectural marvels, so unbelievably precise and massive that they literally seem to defy human capability. And on the other hand, an invisible, deadly force that supposedly struck down anyone who dared to disturb the ancient dead. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on both. We're going to use hard data and historical facts to finally separate Hollywood myths from scientific reality.
Okay, let's jump right into this. When you hear the word pyramid, what is the absolute first image that pops into your head? It's probably the Great Pyramid of Giza, baking in the Egyptian sun, right? Well, what if I told you that the country with the most pyramids in the world isn't actually Egypt at all, but its southern neighbor, Sudan? And what if I told you that everything we know about these ancient megaliths is being completely rewritten right now, not by archaeologists with trowels, but by physicists using space-age lasers, radar, and literally cosmic rays? Welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a massive, highly detailed journey through time and technology to uncover the absolute deepest secrets of the pyramids, leaving no stone unturned.
All right, starting with Section 1, the global pyramid phenomenon.
So we really need to shatter a very common misconception right out of the gate. The idea that pyramids are strictly an Egyptian thing. They absolutely are not. Just think about the sheer scale of this timeline. Cradled in the incredibly dry Supe Valley of Peru, you have the Caral civilization constructing a sprawling urban center with 6 major pyramids around 2627 BC. To put that into perspective, indigenous peoples in the Americas were designing and building these complex structures at the exact same time the ancient Egyptians were working on theirs. The Caral pyramids were these bustling centers of public life anchored by massive sunken plazas. Then, thousands of years later, around the 3rd to 16th centuries AD, Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztecs and Maya brought their own intensely complex era of pyramid building to life.
You can really see the distinct architectural differences based on how they were used. Egyptian pyramids, especially the ones from the Old Kingdom, were engineered as these entirely smooth-faced, pointed structures. They were deeply serene, sealed-off environments meant strictly to house the pharaoh and guarantee his eternal life. The smooth sides actually represented the rays of the sun, a ramp for the pharaoh's soul to ascend. Mesoamerican pyramids, on the other hand, were almost universally stepped and flat-topped. They weren't closed tombs meant to be hidden away. They were active, sometimes violently sacred temples. The flat top was a highly visible public stage for rituals, literally elevating the priests closer to the gods while the entire city watched.
But this global picture gets even wilder when we look at the kingdom of Kush. These striking structures are the Nubian pyramids at Meroe, in modern-day Sudan. The kingdom of Kush held immense power in the ancient world. They actually grew strong enough to conquer and rule over Egypt as the 25th dynasty. During that time, the Kushite kings deeply embraced the Egyptian pyramid-building tradition, but they totally made it their own. Get this, they built over 200 pyramids. That is roughly double the total number found in all of Egypt. And they built them in these tight, densely packed clusters that rise out of the desert like jagged iron teeth.
And if you look closely at the architecture, the angles are fascinating. Egyptian pyramids are angled gently at about 51 degrees, which gives them that wide, incredibly stable base. But the Sudanese pyramids have a much steeper, far more dramatic angle, roughly 70 degrees. Because they have a smaller footprint, this steep pitch let the Kushites build taller structures with less material, though it required totally different load-bearing math. And here's a fun fact. If you look at the pyramid on the back of the US $1 bill, it actually bears a much stronger geometric resemblance to the steep angles of those Sudanese pyramids than the famous ones at Giza.
Moving on to Section 2, Who Built the Pyramids? Time to debunk some myths.
Zooming in on the Giza Plateau, we have got to clear up the Hollywood slave labor myth. The ancient Greeks claimed hundreds of thousands of slaves were violently forced to build these things. But modern archaeology tells a completely different, honestly much cooler story. Excavations in the 90s uncovered these purpose-built workers' villages right next to the pyramids. These laborers were highly skilled, well-paid citizens brought in on a tax levy rotation. We're talking massive bakeries, sophisticated medical care for broken bones, and a premium diet of prime beef and fish. They were so fiercely proud of their work that they left their own Team Graffiti hidden high up inside the Great Pyramid. One team proudly called themselves the Friends of Khufu Gang. You just don't see that kind of camaraderie from a resentful slave crew.
To really put a human face on this colossal state effort, we just have to look at this remarkable papyrus discovered in 2013, hidden in caves near the Red Sea. It's known as the Diary of Meroe. Meroe was a middle-ranking inspector, leading a crew of about 200 men. His logbook details, in strict half-day increments, how his team loaded specialized boats with highly prized, blindingly white Tura limestone. This was the stone used for the outer casing. It was so white it would have intensely reflected the sun for miles. Meroe documents the sheer logistical nightmare of moving these heavy loads up the Nile directly to the construction site. It perfectly captures how the ancient Egyptian state operated, precisely like a finely tuned machine.
Section 3. Bronze Age Engineering. Let's talk about mathematics and muscle.
So we know who the workers were, but how did they actually manipulate millions of tons of hard rock? A really common question is how they cut dense granite when they only had soft copper tools. Iron didn't exist yet. The answer is incredibly ingenious: sand abrasion. They weren't cutting the stone with the copper itself. Instead, they used copper saws in hollow tubes and constantly fed a slurry of loose quartz sand into the groove. It was the microscopic diamond-hard quartz crystals inside the sand doing the actual grinding against the granite. The soft copper was simply the vehicle pushing the hard sand into the rock.
But just because a technique is clever certainly doesn't mean it was easy. Experimental archaeologist Dennis Stocks put this exact method to a rigorous test to recreate the drill marks found at Giza. He built a copper tube, attached it to a heavy wooden bow drill, added the quartz sand, and went to work on solid rose granite. The physical toll was brutal. It took 3 strong men working in a grueling, sweat-drenched rotation for 20 solid hours, pushing themselves to absolute exhaustion just to drill a single hole 6 centimeters deep. When you realize the extreme level of fatigue involved, it gives you immense respect for the sheer physical stamina it took to craft thousands of granite artifacts.
And that physical stamina scales up to some mind-bending mathematics. The Great Pyramid alone contains roughly 2.3 million individual blocks of stone. That's about 6 million tons in total. If we follow the accepted 20-year timeline of Pharaoh Khufu's reign and strictly factor in only daylight working hours, the math becomes staggering. Workers would have had to quarry, shape, transport, and precisely place one massive stone block every 2 to 3 minutes. Let that sink in for a second. One massive multi-ton block perfectly aligned every 2 to 3 minutes continuously for 2 decades. So how is that mathematically possible without invoking lost high technology or ancient aliens? Well, a recent exhaustive engineering analysis evaluated all the physics and material constraints of the era. They found exactly 5 credible theories that hold up to strict mathematical scrutiny. These include using heavy counterweight pulleys down the Grand Gallery to haul stones up, the brilliantly simple method of pulling sledges over lightly wet sand, which essentially halves friction, staged modular construction, and an integrated approach that likely used all these methods simultaneously depending on the phase of the build. The most compelling theory here is the hybrid ramp system, which shows a brilliantly dynamic approach. A single, straight ramp all the way to the top is physically impossible. It would collapse under its own weight. Instead, the theory suggests builders used a large external ramp for just the first 43 meters, where the vast bulk of the pyramid's volume is. Then, as the pyramid grew taller and space got dangerously tight, they transitioned to an internal spiral ramp built directly inside the structure to haul blocks up the remaining 100 meters. For the very top, casing stones, they likely used complex wooden levering systems. They adapted their engineering dynamically as the structure evolved.
All right, Section 4, Scanning the Deep Subsurface. This is where we get into space-age archaeology.
Leaving those Bronze Age tools behind, what exactly happens when we apply 21st century remote sensing technology to these ancient stones? Enter the ScanPyramids Project. Starting in 2015, an international team of physicists used something called Muon tomography. Muons are high-energy cosmic ray particles that constantly shower down from the atmosphere, harmlessly passing right through us every second. Because they travel near the speed of light, they easily penetrate deep into solid rock, but they get absorbed when hitting dense material. By placing sensitive detectors in and around the pyramid and waiting patiently, physicists could catch and map these muons. Where there was a spike in muon activity, it meant there was far less solid rock absorbing them, indicating a massive hidden void. And they captured all this data without moving a single stone. The results were absolutely earth-shattering for the archaeological community. In 2017, the team published in the journal Nature, announcing the discovery of a big void. Located just above the Grand Gallery, this completely unknown, perfectly sealed cavity is massive. It's at least 30 meters long. To help you visualize that, it is essentially a space the exact size of a modern commercial passenger plane, completely sealed off inside millions of tons of solid limestone for 4,500 years. They also detected a smaller corridor-shaped void hidden behind the massive chevron blocks of the north face. And to ensure absolute scientific rigor, these findings were independently confirmed by 3 entirely different teams of particle physicists.
Section 5, Subterranean Cities and Voids. Let's look at the SAR radar findings.
ScanPyramids found massive voids inside the stones above ground. But what lies deep beneath the solid bedrock of the Giza Plateau itself? Researchers Corrado Malanga and Filippo Biondi pushed remote sensing to its absolute limits using synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, beamed down from satellites. Normally, this only penetrates a few meters of sand, but they used a complex workaround called Doppler tomography. They used the radar to measure microscopic, millimeter-scale surface vibrations, essentially mapping the ambient background hum of the Earth's natural seismic energy passing up through the pyramid structure. By analyzing how these microvibrations distorted, they imaged structures down to a staggering 700 meters below the surface. What they claim to have found is just mind-bending, a sprawling 2-kilometer underground network beneath all 3 major pyramids, complete with sharp vertical shafts and 2 cavernous 80-meter cubic chambers. These aren't caves. They are square chambers large enough to comfortably fit an entire Gothic cathedral inside.
Which brings Section 6, Rethinking the Ancient Purpose. Tombs or Technology.
If these massive cathedral-sized radar findings are fully verified by ground exploration, it forces us to ask some deeply profound questions. For well over a century, the strict academic consensus has been that pyramids are just tombs for pharaohs, end of story. But the total lack of any mummies or original sarcophagi found in these deep, newly scanned areas has physicists, engineers, and theorists floating some fascinating alternative hypotheses. Could these deep 80-meter cubic chambers act as grand acoustic conduits, purposefully built to capture natural seismic energy? Structural engineers like Christopher Dunn have hypothesized the Great Pyramid was actually a sophisticated vibrational power plant utilizing the quartz in the granite to generate piezoelectricity. Other researchers are looking at ancient Hermetic lore, suggesting this underground complex could be the legendary Halls of Amenti, a vast, hidden repository of advanced knowledge from a prior forgotten age.
Death shall come on swift wings to whoever disturbs the peace of the pharaoh. I mean, wow. Talk about a terrifying warning. This is the exact threat that supposedly greeted British archaeologist Howard Carter and his entire team when they finally breached King Tutankhamun's tomb back in 1922. It's the ultimate hook, right? A supernatural security system promising total doom to grave robbers and curious scientists alike, and it completely set the stage for one of the most famous legends in human history, the Curse of the Pharaohs.
But before we get totally lost in the biology of those curses, we really need to talk about the sheer physical reality of what the ancient Egyptians actually left behind. And the absolute most staggering part of this mystery, the sheer scale of it all. 6 million tons. That is the estimated weight of the Great Pyramid of Giza. To put that completely incomprehensible number into perspective, just think about the tallest structure in the modern world today, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. The Burj Khalifa weighs a mere 500,000 tons. The Great Pyramid is 12 times heavier than that. And it stood as the tallest structure on Earth for over 4,000 years. So how on earth did a society without cranes, bulldozers, or, even the wheel manage to construct a 6 million ton mountain of perfectly aligned stone?
And then, buried deep underground in the Valley of the Kings, we hit another mind-boggling number, 3,000 years. That is exactly how long King Tutankhamun's tomb lay in absolute, totally undisturbed silence. While all those massive pyramids up above ground were eventually looted over the centuries, Tut's underground tomb managed to remain perfectly sealed off from the ravages of time and human greed. It contained unimaginable wealth, over 5,000 objects including solid gold coffins and even meteorite daggers, just sitting there in the dark for 3 millennia, until a tiny hole was punched through a plaster door in November of 1922.
So this really brings us to the core mystery of our explainer today. Were these monumental structures and the seemingly deadly curses protecting them the work of supernatural forces, alien intervention, or was it something far more grounded? We're going to treat this whole thing like a detective story today. We're putting the supernatural myths on trial and challenging them with the absolute brilliance of historical and scientific truth. And trust me, the facts are actually way cooler than the fiction.
All right, let's move right into our first investigation. Act 1, The Grounded Geniuses. So we need to figure out how on earth they lifted stones weighing anywhere from 2.5 to 80 tons without any modern heavy machinery. And get this, they did it all within a really tight timeline of just about 20 years. Now, for decades, pop culture and fringe theories have fed us these wild myths that the pyramids were built by armies of brutalized slaves or ancient aliens, or maybe even that they were giant electrical power plants. But the historical reality is actually quite different and honestly a lot more impressive. The pyramids were built by 20,000 to 30,000 highly skilled, well-fed, and deeply loyal Egyptian citizens. This was a unified national project. During the off-seasons, when the River Nile flooded the agricultural fields, farmers would literally come to work on the pyramid. They lived in nearby towns, were provided with abundant food, and were treated with massive respect for contributing to the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife.
Okay, but practically speaking, how did they physically move the stones? Well, physicists actually recently cracked a massive part of this code. First off, they discovered that if you pour precisely 2 to 5% water on desert sand, it dramatically reduces the friction for sledges. And the crazy thing is, we actually know they did this because of an ancient tomb painting from 1900 BC that clearly shows a worker pouring liquid on the ground right in front of a massive sledge carrying a statue. It's right there in plain sight. From there, they used an ingenious system of straight, sloped wooden ramps and pillars, using ropes to systematically haul the blocks upward. Finally, they stacked these 2.5 to 80-ton limestone and granite stones, sealing them with a chemical mortar so strong that we still can't perfectly replicate it today. Let that sink in for a second.
And to actually lift and place those absolute units of stone onto the rising tiers, scholars now believe they adapted an ancient tool known as the shadoof. This was basically a really simple but incredibly effective lever mechanism that was originally designed just to draw water from the River Nile for irrigation. By creating a higher central pivot point with a long pole and a counterweight on one side, workers could leverage that same basic physics to lift, turn, and meticulously place enormously heavy stones exactly where they needed to go. So yeah, it's definitely not aliens, it's just pure, brilliant, grounded human engineering.
All right, now let's completely pivot from architectural marvels over to a genuinely terrifying legend. Act 2, The Fabricated Phantoms.
This is where we break down the infamous Curse of the Pharaohs and explore exactly why so many people became absolutely convinced that King Tut was literally reaching out from the grave to claim lives. To really understand the panic, you just have to look at the incredibly spooky timeline of events. In November 1922, Howard Carter and his financial backer, Lord Carnarvon, crack open the tomb. Fast forward a bit to March 1923. Lord Carnarvon gets a mosquito bite on his cheek, accidentally slices it open while he's shaving, and it gets really badly infected. By April 5, 1923, Carnarvon dies in a Cairo hotel. And here's the kicker. At the exact moment he dies, the entire city of Cairo allegedly suffers a total power blackout. Meanwhile, back in England, his beloved dog Susie lets out a sudden howl and just drops dead. I mean, come on, it sounds like the perfect horror movie script, doesn't it?
And the eerie events? They just kept piling up. Right around the time of the discovery, Howard Carter's pet golden canary was reportedly eaten by a cobra that somehow sneaked into its cage. And get this, the cobra is the ultimate symbol of the pharaoh's royal power. You can't make this stuff up. Then the human toll really began. American financier George J. Gould visited the tomb and died of a sudden fever shortly after. Arthur Mace, who was a key member of the excavation team, suffered this mysterious and fatal weakness. Even the father of Carter's secretary, Richard Bethel, tragically leapt to his death from a 7th-floor window in London right after hearing about his son's sudden passing. Ultimately, 22 people connected to the tomb died under what the media love to call strange circumstances.
But hey, remember that terrifying quote from the very beginning of our explainer? The one about death coming on swift wings? Well, the media claimed this curse was written on a clay tablet right there at the tomb's entrance. But the historical reality? That inscription literally never existed. Not at all. Decades later, a security official for the tomb actually confessed that a reporter had asked them about curses, and with a mere smile and some strategic silence, the excavation team basically just let the journalist's imagination run totally wild. The world's most famous curse was completely invented by the media just to sell newspapers. Let's systematically dismantle these mystical deaths using some hard science. Lord Carnarvon? Yeah, he didn't die from an ancient curse. He had actually been chronically ill for years, which is exactly why he wintered in Egypt in the first place. And in an era before penicillin, an infected mosquito bite was basically a death sentence. What about the spooky Cairo blackout? Well, Cairo's power grid in the 1920s was notoriously terrible. Power cuts were literally a daily occurrence. And the dog dying at the exact same moment? When you actually sit down and adjust for the time zone difference between Cairo and London, the times don't align at all. The dog died hours later.
We also really need to shift our focus to the tragic biological reality of the quote-unquote fearsome King Tutankhamun himself. Because the truth is, he wasn't some powerful, vengeful sorcerer. Heavy royal inbreeding in his family lineage caused some really severe genetic disorders. Modern autopsies and DNA tests reveal he was actually a frail teenager with a severe clubfoot, which, by the way, perfectly explains why Carter found 130 walking sticks buried right there with him. He also suffered from incredibly painful Kohler's bone disease and had multiple bouts of malaria. His death was sadly just the result of a young man with a highly compromised immune system finally succumbing to natural ailments.
But what about the other people who died? I mean, is there any actual danger to opening a 3,000-year-old sealed room? Actually, yes, and it's fascinating. Scientists have identified 3 very real, completely grounded hazards. First up, fungus. Spores of Aspergillus niger can survive in dormant states for literal millennia. Breathing them in causes severe respiratory inflammation, which perfectly explains those mysterious fevers some people got. Second, radiation. Some Egyptian tombstones naturally contain traces of uranium. And third, the placebo effect. Never, ever underestimate the power of the human mind. If you truly, deeply believe you are cursed, that intense psychological fear can actively weaken your immune system, making you way more susceptible to illness. The right here is the ultimate twist in our whole detective story. A scientific study published back in 2002 tracked down the life data of the 44 Westerners who were physically present in Egypt during the tomb's excavation. And get ready for this number, 73 years. That was their average life expectancy. In the 1920s, living to 73 was incredibly good. If anything, being exposed to King Tut's curse seemingly favored a surprisingly long and healthy life.
And that leads us to the ultimate mic drop. Howard Carter, the man who actually found the tomb, physically broke the 3,000-year-old seal and spent an entire decade handling the mummy and its treasures. He was literally target number 1 for any ancient curse. But when reporters badgered him for years about the pharaoh's revenge, his response was wonderfully simple. I am still alive. Carter lived for 16 years after opening that tomb, eventually passing away from natural causes at the age of 64. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Why do we so desperately want to believe in magic and curses when human ingenuity, brilliant engineering, and the actual science of biology are just so much more fascinating? Think about that the next time you hear a ghost story. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.
And honestly, that provocative possibility is what you should take away from this explainer today. We are looking at an iconic 4,500-year-old stone structure humanity has studied for centuries. And yet, using cosmic rays, we are just now discovering passenger plane-sized voids hidden inside it. Using orbiting radar mapping the humming vibrations of the Earth, we are potentially finding cathedrals of empty space hundreds of meters beneath it. It begs the ultimate question, were the majestic sun-drenched structures we see reaching toward the sky merely the visible capstones of a much larger, much deeper subterranean enterprise? The science is completely ongoing, the data is still being processed, and the ancient sands clearly have many more profound secrets left to reveal. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today.